I picked up a Newsweek or a Time once about 4 years ago, and I was going through it, and one page I discovered that our St. Louis Park site was among the top 10 in the United States as the worst site. In fact, I think we were second or third on the list.
When the water problem made the newspapers, I had just begun working in the city manager's office. And those articles prompted a lot of calls to City Hall. I talked with some of the people who were calling in after reading the articles, and they were all afraid about the water, concerned whether or not they should be drinking it, if they could get cancer from the water.
I was very concerned about my health, my husband's, and the children, and I think even now I'm concerned about my grandchildren.
I again felt that if there was a severe problem, that the city government would certainly let us know, and they weren't going to put us in a position of jeopardizing our health.
They closed the wells, the contaminated wells, which was of course primary, and cleaned up the site as best they could to prevent future contamination. And then they sought help, financial help, from Riley Tar and Chemical, and I really think that they did everything they could. I was really pleased with the way they moved forward on it. I had no idea it was going to take so long, and I don't think they did either.
Managing a city involves a lot of things. There's a lot of services, a different diversity of services that we provide. Police, fire protection, parks, clean streets, sewer. Those are all essential services that I think a lot of people take for granted. One of the services that people really take for granted, I think, is water. They just don't think about it. They expect when they turn on the faucet it's going to be there. When they go out to wash their car, they can use as much as they want. When they turn on the sprinkle to keep their lawn nice and green in the summertime, they don't mind paying the price of keeping that lawn green and paying for the water. And so water just simply is probably one of the most essential things that we do that people don't think about. And in our society, we have abused that resource, and we need to start recognizing that it's a disappearing resource and that we need to try to conserve it. But it is an essential, absolutely essential municipal operation.
100 years ago, the city didn't provide water for its people. The people would have to dig their own wells. They'd be 30 to 50 feet deep, hit a fairly decent water supply, and be able to raise livestock or just for their own household needs. Sometimes, however, the water supply ran out, or perhaps it even got foul smelling or tasting, and the farmer or the individual would have to drill a deeper well. That's the same type of circumstance that a city faces today. We have to provide water for our people, but the problems we face are somewhat more complex than the individuals faced 100 years ago.
The subject is water. And as many of you know, in recent history, St. Louis Park has had a lot of attention when it comes to dealing with groundwater problems. As far as we can tell, our problem started with the old Republic Creosote site operated by Riley Tar and Chemical Company. The plant was operated since 1917 until approximately 1972. At that site, creosote was manufactured and was used as a preservative on telephone poles and railroad ties. Part of the process called for the excess creosote to be simply dumped onto the ground, and part of that creosote, in fact a lot of it, got into an abandoned well on the site. The rest of it went through a system and series of ditches that ended up in a swampy area south of the site. 50 years ago, nobody realized what the impact of that would someday become. Of course, now we know, unfortunately, that that material, that creosote material, seeped into the groundwater system through the swampy water site and also through an abandoned well on the Riley Tar site. That process, and over time, has brought us to where we are today and where we've had to close 6 of our operating wells.
Riley Tar and Chemical left this site in 1972. It was closed at that time basically because of the pollution of the air. You could even smell Riley tar and chemical as far away as the high school and sometimes almost as far north as 26th Street. At that time, we had no water problem that we were aware of. It was only the smell that was bad and the reason it was removed from this area.
The role that I played when the water problems were first discovered back in 1978, I was the Public Works Director. The contamination was found by the Minnesota State Health Department in a water well screening test that was done throughout St. Louis Park, throughout all the drinking water wells in St. Louis Park. When they found elevated quantities of PAH compounds in our water wells, in our drinking water wells, they did a health risk assessment study and determined that the elevated quantities of these PAH compounds were of a concern. And as a result, they recommended that we close 4 wells, which we did.
The ultimate source of groundwater is simply precipitation that has fallen on the land's surface and has percolated through the soils and recharged the groundwater. For instance, and that is why we do detect groundwater contamination, is that groundwater has flown through a contaminated zone, let's say the Riley tar site, and has migrated down deeper and naturally recharging the groundwater, and on its way down it picked up contamination.
The aquifer where contamination was found was the Prairie du Chien Jordan aquifer, which is the major water supply aquifer for the Twin Cities metropolitan area. The contaminants which are found in the St. Louis Park area are polynuclear aromatic hydrocarbons, or PAHs. It's a large class of chemical compounds of somewhat similar structure, and some of these compounds are thought to be carcinogenic, which is why there's a health concern whenever groundwater supply such as this is contaminated.
Well, what I remember primarily about the public reaction to the well closing is that was the year that I was running for mayor, and the whole thing had just become a very visible issue. The Star and Tribune was running the story about the apparently higher incidence of breast cancer in St. Louis Park, the Minnesota Department of Health study, and so forth. And so it was a very big issue. I tried very hard at all times to reassure people that we were not ever going to do anything that would endanger anybody's health, that we were working with the state and the Minnesota Department of Health to assure that they were going to have safe drinking water. But nothing, I guess you can never, ever reassure everybody. But I think one of the biggest problems we had at that time was knowing just exactly how big a danger we had. What was the problem? No one had ever identified at that time what level of PAHs were dangerous.
The Riley Tar and Chemical site has sure changed since 1972. In those days, there were piles of logs on the site, old metal buildings, places where they did the creosoting, and it just looked like a real mess down in this area. In 1972, in one of the first acts that I did as a councilman at that time, we signed to buy this site for $2 million. The money was made available to us by the federal government to clean up sites of this type. With that, we have cleaned the wells, we have cleaned the site, beautified the site, and have now started a regular testing program on our water. The land has been turned over to the HRA for development. They have developed the Oak Park Village site, they've developed the Rustic Oaks condominium, and other sites are developed on the north end of the property.
In addition to our problem, there were other things that had emerged nationwide as far as water contamination that brought it to the attention of Congress and the realization that they were going to have to appropriate some money.
Congressman Bill Frenzel's office.
St. Louis Park is a perfect example of where the Superfund was able to work. Sites like the Riley site or any other hazardous waste site for which there has not been responsibility assigned and picked up by the operators or managers is absolutely essential. Without Superfund, we couldn't do what has to be done for cleanup. The Superfund, where you can't identify somebody to bill for the cleanup, provides that the cleanup or the purification or whatever will be completed.
Over the years, the city, along with the Environmental Protection Agency and the Pollution Control Agency, conducted a number of studies and a number of tests on different methods to be used to clean up the contamination and return the wells to service. Be nice if a person had the money that was spent on consultants in the last 10 or 15 years. I could afford to take everyone to Florida or wherever, and we could all retire. But those were worthwhile expenditures because it resulted in the development of a system, a carbon filtration system, which we did on a pilot program, and resulted in the final design of a granular activated carbon treatment plant. It has the design of that plant and the method to be used has been approved by the federal agencies, the Pollution Control Agency, and the Health Department. And of course, the Health Department was the one that was originally responsible for closing the wells. The GAC plant was a great breakthrough for us in terms of using the filtration system, returning our wells to operation. And it is that plant that will be hopefully the final touch to our water system and get us back into full operation.
Most cities have a water purification system of some sort or another. Our city's no different. The state has mandated that we treat the water to some degree for many years, and the city has complied. The granular activated carbon treatment system is just another step in the process. Right now, we pump water out of the ground, and because it has a high concentration of iron and manganese, we put it through what we call the iron removal process. After that, the water is treated with chlorine and fluoride. The carbon treatment system that we'll be using is, again, another step in the process, and it's used to purify the water one more time before it's delivered to the system for our users to drink.
The St. Louis Park water system is monitored very heavily. The city exceeds any city I'm familiar with around the country in terms of how often they monitor and what compounds they monitor for. We've hired private laboratories over the past. We typically pay in the neighborhood of about $500 per sample. They look for a family of compounds in the polynuclear aromatic hydrocarbon family. Chrysene, anthracene, fluoranthene are just a couple that can be named. I think we analyze right now 15 different compounds. 90% of those compounds are what they call non-carcinogenic by themselves, but when they interact, they can be carcinogenic. And the remaining 10% are carcinogenic compounds, such as benzoyl alpha-pyrene. We're most concerned about the carcinogenic compounds, but we do have criteria that if we exceed in either category, non-carcinogenic or carcinogenic, we will not use that water from the well.
Granular activated carbon is a form of carbon which has been found to be very effective for removing trace quantities of organic contaminants, such as PAHs, but also other common organic contaminants, such as arise from hazardous waste sites. If you were to look at it, it is very small grains, probably smaller than a grain of sand. And if you were to look at it under a microscope, you'd see that every grain has a lot of peaks and valleys, so that the carbon has what's called a very large surface area. For example, 1 pound of granular activated carbon has a surface area of about 150 acres. And the 20,000 pounds of carbon that's in each one of these tanks has a total surface area of about 5,000 square miles, which is about the size of the state of Connecticut. The treatment plant consists of 2 tanks, 10 feet in diameter and approximately 14 feet high, each of which is filled with about 20,000 pounds of granular activated carbon. Contaminated water from the wells here is passed through this activated carbon and after it comes out the treatment plant, virtually all of the PAH contaminants are removed.
The GAC plant will be located at one of our water facilities at the location of 29th and Idaho. It is at that location that 2 wells, 10 and 15, are closed, and they will be reopened and pumped through the GAC plant where the water will be treated. Eventually, it is hoped that 2 more of the wells, 7 and 9, will also be pumped and put through this treatment system. The plant itself was built at a cost of a little over, in excess of anyway, $750,000, was paid for by Riley Tar and Chemical Company, and is part of the settlement of the prolonged lawsuit that was between Riley, the city, the federal agencies, and the state agencies. It will fit into our system in the sense that we will be able to return those 4 closed wells to operation, and we will be able to be back to full capacity what the water system was in the mid-70s.
I think the GAC plant, as far as the people of St. Louis Park is concerned, is going to be a real asset to the community for 2 reasons. Number one, even though I've never questioned the quality of our water. I think those of us who have worked with the situation recognize that we closed the contaminated wells and we kept open the ones that were safe, and they were always tested for safety. The problem, of course, was the quantity of our water. Did we have enough during the summer months when we had to impose serious sprinkling bans, which, you know, that wasn't the worst thing we had to deal with. But nevertheless, it was a problem, and it was always identified as because of our closed wells. So, number one, this is going to assure more water. The quantity of the water will be sufficient. But it also is a psychological thing, I think. People are going to view this as the solution to our problems. And I really do believe that we're going to be a national trendsetter, if you will. People at other states and other communities are going to be coming to St. Louis Park as their problems become evident, and many, many cities have had a problem. And they're going to say, what did you do, how did you do it, and how is it going to work? So instead of now becoming known as the worst site in the nation or in Region 10 or whatever we were, maybe now we're going to become known as the city that had a problem and solved it.
When you look at all of our resources that we have, we like to think they're all unlimited. And if they're not, we come up with good synthetics, and our technology allows us to do that. But we haven't figured out a way to use seawater yet for salinization process. And so it's important that, I think, for society anyway, that we establish priorities on what kinds of basic things do we always want to be safe and clean. And water is one of them. And we're slowly, unfortunately, too slowly, coming to the realization that unless we start doing something about preserving this resource, we're going to be in serious trouble. We in St. Louis Park can say, well, we've got the GAC plant, now we can just wash our cars and sprinkle our lawns whenever we feel like it. I'm not sure that's the correct attitude. Hopefully we would take the position that we've always had a safe water supply, we still have a safe water supply, now we have a little more quantity. But that doesn't mean that gives us the license to squander a very valuable resource.